Hi, I'm Nathaniel Kahn, filmmaker of My Architect, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. The experience of modernist buildings doesn't start at the doorway. Our first perceptions, the scene, the vibe, the zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it, start with a building's landscape design. Landscape architects are the people who make buildings look good, just like structural engineers keep architects out of trouble when their ideas defy physics. Landscape design is about how you approach a building, what you see, how you get there. Things like outdoor areas, seating, accessibility, pathways, signs, soil, plants, textures, parking, plus the integration with transit, walkways, and utilities. Many noted mid-century modernist houses had landscape architects, but these days they work primarily with larger projects, public parks, museums, airports, resorts, and hotels, among other types. Today we'll talk with landscape architects Chris LaGuardia and Michael van Valkenburgh. Later we get the chat with Pink Martini's Timothy Nishimoto. And now here's your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thank you, Tom. My first memory of landscape design was Pullen Park in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was 6 years old, and I only remember the term landscape design because my father was an architect, and he, of course, noticed and talked about landscape design all the time. The 19th oldest park in the nation, Pullen Park is the crown jewel of the Raleigh Park system.
I didn't know that.
There were kiddie boats, a carousel, and a small-scale train that went in a huge circle, ending in a dark and faux-scary tunnel for a few seconds before ending in the park depot. Scattered around the park were things kids could climb on. There were swings, of course, but we had an old jet fighter. You could climb into the cockpit and even into the engines.
That's a bad idea for a real plane.
Well, if you fell out, no problem. Your mom would just dust you off and send you back.
Right.
We also had an old fire engine where gangs of 6-year-olds would climb on board and simultaneously share a hallucination about putting out Raleigh's biggest fire ever. We would call out to each other like seasoned professionals to raise the ladder or attach the hoses or turn the real steering wheel in different directions. There were no safety bars, no kiddie warnings, no soft sand, just a fire truck mounted in concrete where they wisely removed the battery and engine. Then a little bit later on, they put in these heavy concrete Swiss cheese structures around the park. One bonk and you had a concussion. But this was a small price to pay for the freedom, liberty, and wide-open adventure of a now endangered species, free-range children. One bonk and you learn how not to have that happen again. Today's parks, of course, are much safer. You won't find a fire truck, a jet, or Swiss cheese structures in today's parks. But if there are any left out there, please let me know.
Many parks don't even have swings.
That's right.
That's crazy.
I still have a few missions to fly and a few major fires to fight. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Chris LaGuardia studied landscape architecture at the University of Georgia.
Go Bulldogs!
Before starting his career working with the great Norman Jaffe. In 1994, Chris founded LaGuardia Design Group, focused on merging the art of landscape architecture with environmental science to create beautiful gardens and sustain biodiversity. His award-winning designs are featured in the book Contemporary Gardens of the Hamptons. Here's George's conversation with landscape architect Chris LaGuardia.
Chris, before we start talking about architecture, tell me about your mediocre golf game. How bad are you?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I see it as moments of brilliance followed by disasters. But I do love the game.
Yeah.
It's just like anything, it's a tough one to master. So as a perfectionist, it can be frustrating, but I do love to play. I love being in the outdoors, of course, and the camaraderie of it all. But sometimes you shouldn't take things too seriously, and this is the case.
So is it harder to get to the green or get in the hole once you get there?
It's all hard. So one hole, you have a long putt, another one a great drive. It's a beautiful game. But like I said, I just like being out there doing it when I can. This time of year, I don't get out much because it's our busy season, but love golf courses in general. Love to play all different ones. It's just one of the things I like to do.
Well, this is not your first athletic venture. I read when you were playing varsity soccer under Dan Snyder, the varsity team had 11 shutouts and won their last 10 Section 2 games, ending the season with his first big win since 1967.
Amazing. Yeah. Now, he's a legend, John Snyder. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
He was a legend.
Big time.
So, yeah, soccer was I grew up next to a soccer club. So we played since we were infants, and that was my sport till I was about 40. I played tennis and golf.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now, what influenced you to go into landscape architecture versus architecture?
Well, I grew up in the country. I was sort of the suburban rural fringe, I'd call it. There were subdivisions nearby, but it was all dairy farms, but it's quite beautiful in upstate New York, these rolling hills and pastures. And then in between all that were these ravines and streams and bigger rivers and waterfalls. It was a fantastic sort of place to explore and wander. And so my brother and I was a twin. We adventured a lot. We fished, we hunted, and I developed a certain love for nature. And I developed a certain keen eye for nature. And over time, you develop sort of senses that some people don't have because you spend so much time in it. Going off to college, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I stumbled upon someone that was drawing on a drawing table in their dorm room. And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm designing a park." And I took one look at it and I said, "I want to do that. I want to design something where I can be outdoors and do this and that and the other." And so I didn't know it at the time, but I actually could draw pretty well, better than most. And I excelled, and teachers said you should go on to become a landscape architect. So as you know, I vacillated between architecture and landscape architecture early in my life. I worked for both. And I think that mixture for me was potent as a designer to do work within both disciplines. Combination of nature, being outdoors, the ability to draw, back at the time there weren't any computers, helped me excel while in school. And just a great love of the outdoors has driven it to this day.
And your projects, I notice on your website, are all over the place. You have commercial projects, you have public ones, you have a lot of residential modern. For people who are thinking about engaging a bigger landscape plan than just throwing down some grass,
right.
What are the rookie mistakes that people make that if they consulted you, they wouldn't make?
Well, yeah, there's many. Having a full understanding of plants and how they grow over time is a big one. You often see people planting things and they engulf their home in a couple of years, or they plant things that can't survive in the certain climatic conditions. A lot of nuance to picking the right plant for the right spot or a group of plants. And so it's just lack of knowledge, really. And that's just the planting aspect of it. We do a lot of site planning, so the projects tend to be bigger and they're more complicated, zoning codes, that sort of thing. So that's where novices will often get themselves in a lot of trouble just by not understanding the complexity of the site design and all the things that go with it.
And I think much like Disney designs the experience of everything in a ride, from the time you start at the beginning of the line to the time you go through to the time you exit in the gift shop.
Right.
You're designing a total experience around a house.
Indeed.
The different areas that people can be in. So what are some of those kinds of experiences that you do most often?
We're fortunate enough to work on fairly large properties compared to a lot of other parts of the country. Many are well over an acre. Some are 5 acres, 40 acres, so larger sized plots. And in the end, I think the spatial sequence starts with the driveway and how you enter the property from a landscape standpoint and what you experience as you drive through the property and how you see the landscape, but more importantly, how you unveil the architecture. Okay, you may see a distant view of it. You may not orient that driveway in such a way to reveal the nicest aspects of the architecture. And in traditional design, you see a lot of axial symmetry and frontal perspectives of homes. But in modern architecture, I think it's nicer to be sort of asymmetrical, to approach a house more in a three-quarter view, to see it in a full two-point perspective. So the driveway initiates that sort of reveal of the building, a series of vignettes, and then your arrival court. And then you'll have, once you get out of your car, I call it the entry sequence, which is the process of getting out of your car and working your way to the front door. And this can be any number of things. Usually I like to have at least 50 to 75 feet of distance. You don't want it too far and you don't want it too short. So you want to go through a series of layers of things that by the time you get to the front door of the house and put your hand on the door handle, you've been conditioned. Okay, so you're not just slammed up to the house, but you've entered through a garden. You've entered through a sequence of light and shade, and maybe there's some other amenity, or there's sound of water or something to make it more interesting. There's scents from different plants, and all this entry sequence really sets you up for really seeing the interior of the house.
And the lighting, too, I would suspect, right? The way it's lit.
Oh, yeah. So you're going to incorporate some lighting along this pathway as well, because people are coming and going. And you want it to be safe, but you also don't want it to be overly done. So some subtle moonlighting can be very effective. But it's all about, working your way up sequentially. And a lot of times there's vertical elevation to make up. So we like to not engage a lot of steps, like maybe there's 3 at a time. And that's part of our design work. We're doing a series of levels, integrating plant into it. So it's very nice, soft approach. I don't like landings that are over my eye level. Like I want to see where I'm walking to next. So that's always one of our moves that we look to do.
I've been in a couple of really nice houses where the entry experience is almost like an obstacle course. You've got, for instance, these water features with stones sticking up you're supposed to walk on, and one false move and you're in the drink.
Yeah, especially after dinner. And, it gets a little bit ostentatious at times, some of these folks with all that kind of thing. I try not to go too crazy, but there's a certain expectation from our clients. They've been to their friends' homes. They like something similar, but different. We're in the Hamptons. It's very high-end architecture, some of the most expensive real estate in the country. So there's a certain level, I think, of design and certain elements they're looking for. A lot of it driven by some, luxury resorts they may visit, like Amanyara or something. They're looking for a home like that, in a sense. So that's what we're used to. You really know it when it's not there, when you're missing that whole experience.
Let's go back 40 years to when you're working for the great Norman Jaffe out in the Hamptons.
Right.
What were some of the houses that you were working on then?
Many different ones, really. I did an addition on an early home of his from the late 60s, 70s in Sam's Creek. Worked on that. And then Norman went through a series of phases in his career. So he had these very small sculptural houses he started with, and then he went into bigger sculptural houses that got a little out of hand. And then he went into these, in the later part of his career where I worked, into these colonnaded homes. There's a famous one, looks almost like the Parthenon. And he got into this system of columns, whether square or round, and organizational system around that. And what I liked about it, for me, was the way it integrated well with the landscape. Every room opened out. This sort of grid would extend out into the landscape. And so the landscape and the home would become one. And that's where he was at the end of his career, was this sort of home. And he did many like that. A lot of it started with a high-rise, actually, he did in New York City called Water Street, I believe it was. And it had this great colonnade of columns. And I think he was sort of obsessed with columns. He would mention Karnak, or mention the Acropolis. And
sure.
He was a creative guy that was always going on to something else. He never stayed on something too long. But the vocabulary throughout his career was often repeated in a lot of ways, details. Very sculptural, sort of artist-like mind, in a sense, but still very skilled as an architect spatially. But he had an innate idea of fantasy, and the idea of sculpture were big in the office.
I've noticed that the Architecture Review Board out in the Hamptons has been very active trying to preserve some of his houses, including that one with the columns that you mentioned.
Right. They're trying to pass new laws. Now, there's so many municipalities out here. So you're talking about Southampton Village.
Yes.
Which is just ironic because back in the day, in the 70s, he built the home for Horace Bliss.
Oh, yes.
It was this very James Bond needle-like house, and it was right by the vaunted Meadow Club, this sort of waspy stronghold, and they all objected to it, so they were required to plant tall hedges in front of it so they couldn't see it. They didn't want to look at it. And now the owner wants to demolish it, and now everybody's up in arms to save it. So things evolved, tastes evolved, and now his homes, they see him as sort of a cultural treasure to the Hamptons, much like Paul Rudolph in Sarasota or Lautner in Palm Springs. You hate to lose your culture of what happened before. This is late mid-century modernism in a way. And so many of his homes have been torn down. Okay, so now people are putting the brakes on a little bit here.
Some of the most entertaining TV is watching the Architecture Review Board hearings, which I do every couple of weeks.
Yeah.
As they've been turning into some yelling matches between the attorneys involved for the clients and the review board itself. In case you haven't caught that lately, it's... I
hear it. And, it's just so subjective, and a lot of people on the boards are not educated. They just say, I like it or don't. Or it's just completely and utterly frustrating when you're dealing with, they're a little ignorant about architecture in a way, and they shouldn't even be on the board. And yet, in some ways, it's good too. You don't want to build a bunch of bright pink stucco houses here either. So there is some guidelines that are good about the scale. Lately, it's been about light pollution. Homes with a lot of glass project a lot of light. So all these things, there's good and there's bad of these regulations. But certain boards, have the Village of Southampton, Sagaponic is quite difficult, and others are more amenable. So you got to read the particular board, and you're not going to get passed unless you have enough give back to let them approve you. So it's part of being creative.
So you've worked with Norman Jaffe. I assume that at some point you encountered Harry Bates.
Oh, yes, many times. I mean, him and Norman were competitors. Harry was very successful, but he was such a gentleman, you couldn't get mad at him. Harry was great, and he only died a couple of years ago.
Right.
And he did so many homes. We're working on a big condominium complex he did called Meacock's Landing, and it was built in the 80s, and it still looks great. They're maintaining it better now. It's just an iconic Harry Bates design here in Watermill. But so many of his homes are scattered all over, a lot of little homes, but they all have a great presence to them. Loved Harry.
I got to visit with Harry in Fernandina Beach, Florida, after he retired. He built the most brilliant little jewel box home I've ever been in.
Wow.
About 1,200 square feet. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, 1 big open space. That was it. And just immaculately designed for himself. And I think he got to live there like 4 or 5 years before he passed on.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Love to see it sometime. What city is that in?
Fernandina Beach, Florida.
Fernandina Beach. I don't know where that is.
If you go to the Harry Bates page on our website, you can see it.
Okay, cool. That'd be great.
When is the best time, Chris, for the landscape architect to be engaged for a house, say? Is it after the house has already been designed and then you come on? Is it at the very beginning when they're just, drawing sketches on a piece of paper? I mean, when is the ideal time to get involved with the architect and the client?
Yeah, well, there's the ideal and the ordeal. Okay. The ordeal is when I get in too late and I have to make chicken salad out of chicken. The ideal is when the clients will come to me and ask me to look at 3 or 4 pieces of land and tell me what I think of it. And I will conceptually even draw different ideas for each piece and then guide them to pick that piece. And then they'll even say, do you have some architects you recommend? So I'll give them 3 or 4 architects that I love to work with. I said, you interview them and see who you fit with best. And then from the get-go, I'm involved with helping to site the house, helping to design it, looking for opportunity. I have some great collaborators, that I've worked with over many years, a lot of repeat work, some really talented architects here on the East End and some in the city as well that we've done many projects for. So it's a collaborative process. Those are the best projects to work on, and really love it still, that collaborative process with these great relationships over many years. Working with a new architect is always challenging too. I have to sort of get into their head, like what are they looking for? what is their design philosophy, and how can I help them along and make the house better without insulting them in any way. So
Sure.
I'm trying to be complementary to the architecture.
Do you find yourself doing more new houses or renovations of existing houses?
I'd say that's probably at 60% new homes, 40% renovations of existing landscapes or homes. Something like that would be the break. But there's still a lot of new construction going on here, and we're working all over the place at this point. We're almost international, working in the Caribbean, all over the Northeast. So it's still happening. It's this very high-end residential market is still cooking pretty good.
I'm amazed how bringing good landscape design to an existing house really changes the house.
Indeed. The existing homes are built, there's a landscape installed, and the initial intentions are probably pretty good, I think. But over time, the building stays good, but the landscape changes to a point where it becomes overgrown. A tree may become 10 times bigger than when you planted it. So the landscape changes. And it's about a 10, 15-year window where you need to revisit projects because ecologically they've changed substantially. And out here in the Hamptons, there's a lot of open farm field projects, right? There's no trees at all. It's just open land. And so you initially get in there, form a certain amount of privacy screening, plant a certain amount of trees, and it looks good right away. But like I said, in 10 or 15 years' time, that landscape's changed substantially. So you have to reimagine it, really, based on that new ecology. So those are common now. In my career, I have clients call me back 25 years ago. Like, come on over, we want to do it again. But that's the thing that really I see as gardens evolve. They're not static. That's also a fun part of it, too.
What are the newest developments in landscape design and materials? Like, is there some new sexy ground cover that people are getting into, or a plant that's on the rise? I mean, what's the Taylor Swift of landscape architecture now, Chris?
Well, clearly, ecology is big and on the forefront. Okay, everybody's getting away from pesticides and chemicals and trying to live a more ecologically diverse, and a lot of our projects go that way. It's not just a pretty picture Victorian era idea. It's more science-based and more ecologically based. The idea of using native plants that support wildlife. This is a very big tip right now. It's almost expected on all our jobs. And a lot of times it's even required by the municipalities that you utilize a certain amount of native plants, like 70% or so. So that's gotten very big. And then the lawns in themselves, like no longer now is the giant mowed lawn sort of a status symbol it used to be. It almost looks like excessive consumption. So meadows have gotten very popular. And so managing how to do a meadow correctly has been a transition. Almost all our products incorporate this idea of meadows versus more tailored lawn. And clients buy into it. They agree. They're like, this is what we want to do.
So is a meadow just an uncut lawn, so to speak? I mean, how do you define a meadow versus a lawn?
A lawn is a cut meadow.
Okay.
That's everything. A lawn, there are very few grasses that grow very low. There are basically cut meadows. Although there's a lot of nuance in it, obviously. Most mowed lawn is what we call cool season grass, Kentucky bluegrass. It makes a beautiful green lawn. It makes a terrible meadow.
Yeah.
But these warm season grasses like you see in, say, a Fairfield Porter painting, blue stem or the amber waves grain kind of look, those are warm season grasses. They stand up really nicely, switch grass.
Is that actually the name of a grass, amber waves of grain?
No, but there could be. I could make that. Amber waves.
Yeah.
There's sort of like that kinetic meadow effect of the wind blowing on it. It's very romantic. And a lot of times it doesn't look that great really close to a home, but as you work your way away, it's quite beautiful.
I imagine it'd also be fun for people if they're into art and want to do paintings of your landscapes. Have you had any artists do renderings of your projects?
Not painting so much. A lot of photographers, but like the Monet type idea of the garden as painting. I haven't seen that yet. A lot of my projects, there's a lot of green, a lot of tones of green. I don't do a lot of flowers. We have some that are more floral. I like verdant green tones. I think it's a lot more calming. I find flowers to be a little jarring to me, and I like them, but I just don't like them in my face all the time.
Yeah.
So I mostly tell clients, let's first get a palette of green there. Then over time, we will paint in a very painterly fashion, add some color. But the gardens are not based on color other than greens, or maybe some white, another more neutral color that I weave in. And eventually some lavender or blues, I try to keep it really cool. That's where I like to be.
Chris, you've done an amazing amount of projects. Tell me your website where people can see these.
Okay. Well, it's www.laguardiadesign.com. Some great projects on there. And you see the team. You see my partners, my wife, Jane, my other two partners, Ian Handback, Dan Thorpe. They're very good designers of a very high order. They've been with me for 20 years. And so under us, we have some great project managers. And so the service end of our business is really important. And client goes to build a new home and build a landscape. But you want it to be a very pleasurable experience. And we deliver that because we're so organized now. And it wasn't that way when I was younger. It was a little chaotic. And I learned that from Norman because he was totally chaotic. But we got beautiful work done. But the service that we offer and the team and the staff that work with me on so many projects is really what I'm very proud of. Just try to make it a fun experience, and doing it. So our clients should have fun too.
And is this generational, Chris? I noticed there was another LaGuardia in there besides you and Jane.
Right. Yeah. Our kids have both worked here. Our daughter does some PR work for us. My son's a landscape architect. He just graduated from the Harvard GSD, and he lives in Boston now. He loves it there. But eventually he'll come back to the firm, give him a few years out on his own and not have his father on him. So, but we have an office in New York City. He might work there first.
Okay.
And transition out here. But
okay.
He's done well. I had him working for contractors since he was very young. And he loves doing it. He likes working with me on projects here and there. And like I said, my wife and I work together. We both went to horticulture school together, so we have that common interest together. We love gardens. We love going to gardens. We love traveling, going overseas and seeing gardens. It's the thing that binds us, really, other than our kids.
Well, another famous LaGuardia New York dynasty. Thank you so much for talking with me, Chris.
Good. All right. Nice speaking with you as well.
That was George talking with Chris LaGuardia. Michael van Valkenburgh is head of MVVA, the landscape architecture firm he founded in 1982. Raised on a dairy farm in upstate New York, he received degrees from Cornell.
Go Big Red.
And the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign.
Go Fighting Illini.
His firm's work on the Brooklyn Bridge Park earned multiple awards, including a 2021 Rosa Barba International Prize of Landscape Architecture. That park, a stunning success, completely captures the spirit and energy of New York City. He is the Charles Eliot Professor in Practice of Landscape Architecture at Harvard, where he has taught since 1982. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So before we talk about architecture, let's talk about insects. Our ACE research team discovered that you won a 4-H award for entomology at 17. What was that all about?
Well, I grew up in rural America, and 4-H was a thing to do. It wasn't school. It was project-oriented, which was, sort of better for me than scholastic things. There were projects that you could do in 4-H, and I was very interested in insects, yeah.
And so what was the award for? What did you do?
I got interested in the production of chrysalises, which I ended up selling for research to places like the Cornell Ag School. I mean, that was the end run of it, was figuring out which butterflies or moths grew on what plants, getting a hold of eggs in a variety of ways, and then propagating them. And then when they turned into this dormant stage between caterpillar and adult, the chrysalis, they were bought for research.
And I guess this is a natural part of what you do professionally in landscape design, because you've got to pay attention to the insects in the area.
Well, you certainly do.
And what are some of the things that you have to look out for with your projects? Is it that you're going to get too many of them or the wrong kind, or what challenges do you generally face?
Not really my expertise, to be truthful, but I can spin you an answer.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Talking about metamorphosis and cocoons and all.
I mean, trees and plants that are subject to infestation are always in dynamic rotation. And, you think you have it all figured out with one thing, and, suddenly there's yet some other problem that's come out of the blue. Do you know about the lanternfly?
No.
Oh, it's kind of a plague.
It's a highly invasive insect. I'm not sure exactly where it came from, but it sort of came out of the blue. And they descended on I live in an apartment building in Brooklyn, and they descended on our ivy plants. And I was not in Brooklyn at the time, and my building super sent me photographs of sort of ravaged Boston ivy plants covered with these black bugs with spots on them. So, the way I react to it is you do your best, but you more have to be vigilant about how evolving insect pests are in the landscape.
When the general public goes to visit buildings, a lot of times they don't really understand or acknowledge that there's a landscape architect involved in all this, right? And you're managing the approach to that building and the pathways, the accessibility, connections to transit, all those different things that shape the experience from the first time a person even steps across the property line.
That's true.
And as you consider the building, at what point do you get involved? Do you get involved in the very beginning of a building with the site, or more when it's under construction? How does that process take place with your involvement?
Well, every architect that I work with sort of does it differently.
Okay.
Take Toshiko Mori, for instance, the architect that I've done, quite a few residential projects with. Also, we've done an office building up in Cambridge for Novartis. And Toshiko likes to have the landscape architect involved from the beginning. She's not, by the way, a particularly controlling architect. She's just more of a believer that her projects come out better if the team is working together from the beginning. She's a very strong collaborator. When you work with Toshiko, it's sort of architect, landscape architect, side by side. She does her thing, I do my thing, but we're not at all uninformed about what the other is doing. We're thinking very much about, of course, how they come together, but also just if you're a person outside of the building, what's the relationship of being in the landscape to what it's like to go inside? They're next to each other, and one informs the other, whichever way you're going, inside to out or outside to in.
That sounds like an ideal way to do it.
It's a good way. Yeah, it's a good way. And it's a fun way to work together. On the other hand, sometimes I come into projects when they're far along. I've just recently done a project here on Martha's Vineyard, which is where I am today, with Marianne Thompson, the architect. I, by the way, often start early with Marianne, but in this particular instance, the house is very far along. And, I think they were thinking that landscape was going to play a smaller role than it did because the site was relatively narrow and the building kind of greeted you in a kind of major architectural way when you arrived.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started looking at it with Marianne and the owner, and we actually started to think of landscape that I was making as creating a condition that you would experience before actually getting to the house. In other words, let's say you come onto the property and you see the house in front of you, right? What I was saying was maybe we make a landscape that you actually enter and are absorbed by. And when you leave the landscape that I make, then you come into a space that's before the space where you enter the house.
Yeah.
Kind of as a way to slow it down.
So you had room to be able to make that happen on the lot.
You have to have that room.
Yeah.
And you also have to have a client that wants to do that. What she kind of liked about my idea, which was this sort of grove of trees that you actually drive around rather than driving right up to the front door, there's this grove of trees in the driveway. She really liked the fact that she could come in with her groceries, park right near the kitchen door, maybe leave her car there. And when other people came to visit, they didn't see a car in front of the house. They saw this grove of trees.
That's such a great idea. We take for granted as just general public uninformed, stupid, that when you come up to a building, that the architect that's got the name on the plaque has done everything. But the more that you explore about what landscape architecture is all about, and particularly with parks, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, it's really quite the tapestry of experiences. I mean, you're almost giving a kind of Disney plan where you turn around this curve and there's one experience, and you go this way and there's another, and you're combining these experiences together to give people a sense of wonder, really.
Yeah, and I think as humans, we're sort of wired to be very comfortable with quick transitions of experience. I mean, it's sort of like one of the things that's amazing about us is that we can be doing this, and a very short time later, we can be doing that, and we very effortlessly shift gears, you know? And I think that landscapes become kind of exciting and appealing and magnetic to people when you're constantly having a new point of view or experience or the degree of enclosure that's around you. It's stimulating.
You've done a lot of residential projects with Toshiko Mori that we've documented. Martha's Vineyard, several in Maine, one in Bedford, New York.
Right.
And back in the day, a lot of the celebrated mid-century architects almost always had a landscape architect working with them on houses, which doesn't seem to be the case so much today. Why do you think that is?
I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm not disagreeing with you. I have a small number of landscape architects. They don't always work with me, but, you know, there's a small group of them that like working with me, and, you know, I'm often involved in their projects. But I don't know. It's a good question. One thing that occurs to me is that take Saarinen and Kiley, for example.
Right.
They had a kind of more unified aesthetic, the two of them. Like the Miller Garden, which is admittedly an unusual and big residential project in Columbus, Indiana, but there's almost a formal, spatial, stylistic similarity between how Kiley is using plants outside and how Saarinen is organizing space inside. You know, through the geometry and through the unfolding of space and stuff like that. I contrast that with working with Max Scoggin and Merrill Elam, who I'm sure you know.
Oh, sure.
You know, the first time I worked with Mac and Merrill, we pulled up to this house, and, you know, it was pretty far along. It's a great house and very, you know, unusual. Like a lot of Mac and Merrill's work doesn't look like something people have done before. It's a strong originality. And I suppose I said something pathetic to Mac, like, you know, well, what do you want me to do? And he's like, I don't know what I want you to do. Whatever you do, I don't want it to look like my building. I want the landscape to look like a landscape, and I want my building to be distinctive. And I'm like, you know, Mac, that's very matter of fact to you, but a lot of architects don't actually feel that way. You know, they don't actually want a kind of autonomous expression to the landscape. But that's Mac and Merrill, you know. That's sort of very central to their feelings about design and people using space.
You have completed recently a project called the Brooklyn Bridge Park. There's a book on it. It just came out, right?
Yep.
And this goes back a lot of years. When did you start working on this thing?
We started working on Brooklyn Bridge Park in 1999, and we were part of an economic planning team that had been hired to prove to the mayor and the governor that the park could be planned in a way that when it was completed, the maintenance would be supported through income generating opportunities at the periphery of the park. The leaders were economic planners. There was HRNA in New York City, and there were urban designers. And then we were kind of subconsultants to the urban designers. So we were pretty far down the list initially, because what the park was going to look like wasn't really what they were worried about. What New York learned in the 70s and 80s is that parks are expensive to build, but they're more expensive to maintain.
Right.
Roughly every 20, 25 years, the cost of maintaining a park accrues to the point where it equals the cost of the capital construction. So you build a park, in 100 years, 4 times you've spent the cost of construction on maintaining the park. And, you know, that's
a lot of money.
That's a lot of money. And with income streams being unstable for cities and parks. The politicians at the time, who were particularly conservative because they were inheriting all these economic problems, said, well, you guys need a park over in Brooklyn, but we don't want the city and the state to have to maintain it. The way that played out over the next 20 years was that apartment buildings were built primarily, also a hotel and also a mixed-use building, but primarily residential buildings were constructed at the edge of the park, on the edge of the city, and the taxes that they would have paid to the city and the state are directed to a fund that maintains the park.
Now let's set the stage for people who are listening about where this is. So we got New York, Manhattan, the Brooklyn Bridge. This is a huge project, really. It's 80-some acres, right?
Right.
And it was a 1950s shipping facility, basically, for containers, I believe.
No, the other way around. The reason it became obsolete is that containers came into the world and the East River was so shallow that container ships could not navigate the East River.
Okay.
So right after World War II, they built this magnificent series of piers south of the Brooklyn Bridge, and almost immediately container shipping began. The idea of that is you make something somewhere, you put it in a container, and it doesn't come out of the container until it's going to be sold to somebody.
Yeah.
So the labor cost of lifting, storing, moving, all of that goes away with container shipping. It's much more efficient in terms of people's time, which is, of course, somebody's money.
But the ships are bigger now.
Much bigger, yes.
Bigger and longer, but also incredibly deep. And the East River's, it's not a very deep, it's not a river, actually. It's a tidal strait. It connects the Sound that's north of Long Island with New York Harbor. So it's quite shallow. And so they had to abandon the warehouses.
How long were they empty?
Long time.
Really?
I mean, they were pretty much on their way out by the early 80s. And they were not torn down and the park built until like about 2006, 8, something like that. So they're there a long time. It's not that things weren't being done in them. They were being used as warehouses. They just didn't have any relationship to shipping. People would go there and put lumber there or whatever.
Now, here's a project where you're going to take a bunch of warehouses on 85 acres and turn it into this beautiful park that's also going to be financially self-sufficient. Sounds great to me, but I understand there was also a lot of opposition to this as well. Where did that come from?
Oh, well, it came from a lot of places. We had the party for this book that Fiden put out that documents the 25 years. It's called Brooklyn Bridge Park. We were having an opening, and one of the most ardent opponents came up to me with a big smile, and he shook my hand. He's like, we were wrong. The park is great. But it came from a lot of places. First of all, it was very isolated at the time. Nobody was living down there. It was vacant. People were afraid of it. It seemed very cut off from the city because of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, which it is. It is cut off. There's a limited number of points where you can get to the park. So people were just worried about safety. Other people didn't want the rest of Brooklyn walking through their neighborhood to go to a borough-wide park. They liked the kind of isolation of Brooklyn Heights and the separation from the rest of the city. That is not a majority of the people who lived in Brooklyn Heights, but some of the strong opposition came from people who didn't want to open up the waterfront to everybody else.
Mm. And it's a huge success now. I mean, people are just tripping over themselves to visit there. And I understand you visit there a lot as well?
I live about a 10-minute walk away. I mean, I go there when I'm in New York 5 or 6 days a week. I mean, of course, sometimes I go every day, but, I'd say on an average 5 or 6 times I go down there.
I want to visit it next time I go up to Brooklyn because I've just been thrilled reading about it, Michael.
I'd love to take you. Let's do it.
Let's do it. I want to walk down there with you. Now, another project that you've been involved in is the Obama Presidential Center in Chicago's Jackson Park.
That's right.
You're going to be doing the landscape design for that. How does one get picked to do a presidential project? Is it a competition? Is it you're calling up somebody and saying, hey, I want to participate? How does it work?
I've done two.
Really?
From both sides of the aisle. So I worked on George W. Bush's presidential library in Dallas. And that was because I had worked with First Lady Laura Bush on the redesign of Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House. And that was a competition that we won.
Okay.
So in a roundabout way, getting to do it was the result of entering and winning a competition. For the Obama library, there was a competition also. There were 8 architects invited to generate schemes. And I work fairly often with Todd Williams and Billy Chen, who are the project architects.
Sure.
They asked me and my office to be involved in the competition. So that was a selection that came from a competition as well.
For the Obama project, in the presidential library, what do you want people to experience before they get to the building?
The buildings that Todd and Billy created hug the city street edge of Jackson Park for a number of reasons: to use less parkland, to have people walking shorter distances, to make it feel like it's part of the neighborhood, all of those things. But the area before the primary entrance is sort of a public plaza. It's a place that greets people. There are a fair number of trees with planters. You're arriving, you want to sit down with your friends or your family and kind of figure out how you're going to organize the day. It is definitely an honorific space that the architects themselves had a lot to do with. The president, who's kind of a design buff, was very active in the design. George W. wanted to be informed, but First Lady Laura Bush kind of led the design of the landscape in Dallas. Here, I would say President Obama was particularly interested in the arc. There wasn't anything that he wasn't interested in. He's a fascinating and brilliant guy. But the organization of that space is primarily through architectural gesture, and then the creation of a plaza, and then the populating of the plaza with these large circles of trees. And Martin Puryear, the sculptor, was also in there much of the time in the early stages of design, commenting on the design in general and planning this kind of very enigmatic, beautiful piece of sculpture. So in a sense, it's a kind of classic urban arrival, but we were really focused on humanism and comfort, knowing people have made a long trek to get there. They need to be comfortable. They need to sit in the shade. They need to feel safe. They need to be able to see where the door is, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was really like planning the entrance of any building, but kind of greatly pumped up in importance as a civic building.
Before this site was going to be a presidential library, wasn't George Lucas involved somehow in wanting to put a facility there?
Yeah, I only know that that's true. I think there was a museum, I think,
Yes.
and I don't even remember whether it was of art or cinema. I think
it was Star Wars kinds of
Oh,
stuff.
yeah, there was a Star Wars museum.
I don't think it ended up in Chicago.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's somewhere else now.
Nor will it
Yeah,
be
I think
incorporated into the Obama Library.
Yeah, it's definitely not in there.
When will it open?
I think we're going to open mid to late 2025 is the current thinking.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Do people access that by how? Is it mostly driving? Is it hooked up to the metro?
The metro is not far away. There's a very large underground parking garage, and it's right on the city bus system.
Okay.
The positioning of it in that part of Chicago urbanistically was a big part of it, with various locations, not only Jackson Park played out in the beginning. It's also very near the University of Chicago.
Well, that's another place I can't wait to visit once it opens up. Michael, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. We're really honored to talk with you, and I will take you up for a walk around Brooklyn Bridge Park.
I would love it. Thank you.
Raised in Los Angeles, Timothy Nishimoto discovered his love of music at a very early age. He began singing and performing at age 2 and continued through college at Cal State Long Beach.
Go Beach Athletics!
Often performing with jazz ensembles and barbershop groups. He has performed with the world-famous small orchestra Pink Martini, a classical jazz global crossover group. At first, Timothy was a guest, but he became a permanent Pink Martini in 2003 on vocals and percussion. Attentive listeners will remember our past interviews with Pink Martini members China Forbes and Storm Large. George caught up with Timothy recently on Zoom.
Timothy, let's start this conversation with your suits. You have got some great suits. Some of them almost reflective. I know there's a particular gray one that's really bright. Where do you get these things?
That one is actually basically a shark skin suit. I had that made in Vietnam when we were there. We've played a few times, but in one particular time, I decided to have a suit made, and I got to go and pick out the material, and I had a couple shirts made, and I really wanted something that kind of stood out a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I am front and center, a few times during shows, but I didn't really want anything that would make me stand out if I wasn't front and center. So I picked the material from a little swatch, I went into the room next door, and it was just completely overwhelming with, millions and millions of swatches of cloth material for options for the suit. And I just went with the first one because I was so overwhelmed. And when I got it home, they delivered it like a month or two later, and I saw the suit. And I thought, oh my gosh, this might be a little too much. But it was $215.
Wow.
To have a suit made.
Yeah. What a deal.
And the shirts were $35.
Well, you look totally sharp in it out there.
Thank you. Well, I don't fit into it currently. So I had another one made, but it's kind of a beautiful dark green suit made by a local company in Portland called Wildwood and Company. And I don't think I'll go anywhere else for a suit. There's nothing like having a suit made for you, specifically for you. And the whole process was really cool. Just going in for fittings and, sip a little bourbon while you're, doing this or that. But, well, thank you for the compliment.
Now, beside the suits, I've always wondered, you're holding often some sort of like small beehive-shaped object. It looks wooden and it's brown, and you tote it around the stage and you knock on it occasionally. What is that thing?
It's called a guiro. It's spelled Guiro. And they were originally just a hollowed out gourd with little ridges on it. And then you have what's called a striker. And you don't pound on it, but it's the instrument that sounds or so yeah, it's called a guiro. And it's the one that I use is fiberglass made by LP Percussion. That's kind of my forte.
And where did that come from originally? Was that from
I believe it's Cuba.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when you're not playing it or singing, I noticed that in the background, you're kind of the stage manager of things in the back. You're like directing people to put this there and go over here and do that. And you kind of keep things in order for the band.
Yeah. I mean, I try, but I do play a few other hand percussion instruments like the shaker. And by the way, the shaker is much harder than it looks. And often it keeps the rhythm for the whole band in a lot of ways. Of course, there's the drummer, but Thomas is the leader of the band. In most of the percussion, there are sometimes 3, sometimes 5 of us percussionists in the band on stage at one time. And the other guys are on stage left, but he likes to have me stage right by the piano and by the violin and guitar and bass. He likes to have me there to sort of be the axis of the rhythm section, at least for that side of the stage. So I play shaker and the crash cymbals and clave and a little bit of timbales. And that's one of the things that I love about being in this band is I'm not doing the same thing 2 songs in a row, really. As you know, I sing lead on a few songs, but I love singing backup vocals, and I'm constantly moving on stage. I love it. I like being busy.
Your signature song is Donde Estás, Yolanda? How did that song come about?
Originally, I was a guest vocalist with the band in 1994, so 30 years ago. And for the first 2 years, I had a few songs that I would sing with the band. And a gentleman named Pepe, and his last name is escaping me, but Pepe was also a guest vocalist with the band more randomly than I was. But I wasn't really a permanent member of the band at that time, but I stopped singing with the band in 96. And that's when Thomas started thinking about recording an album. And Thomas really wanted Pepe to sing Donde Estás, Yolanda. But then I officially joined the band in 2003. I started singing, and I've been singing it pretty much since. I think a lot of people don't realize that it's not me singing it on the original recording from Pink Martini. I feel bad when I have to let people down and say, I love your song. It's my favorite song. We listen to it all the time. And so I have to kind of break people's heart and say, sorry, that wasn't me. But I'm proud to say that it now is my signature song.
Here's Timothy with Donde Estás, Yolanda.
¿Dónde estás, Yolanda?
Con ese fue caliente, ardiente tu mujer, la luz de tu mirada, el fuego de tus labios, me echaron a mi pecho y de ti me enamoré. ¿Dónde estás, Yolanda? ¿Qué pasó, Yolanda? Te busqué, Yolanda, y no estás, Yolanda. ¿Dónde estás, Yolanda? ¿Qué pasó, Yolanda? Te busqué, Yolanda, y no estás, Yolanda. Chiqui, 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 ah. Paseabas en un carro, Yolanda, muy guapo, arrogante, y todos se silbaban. Y ni encontrada, no sé qué puedo hacer, no se vuelvo loco si no te deba ver. ¿Dónde estás, Yolanda? ¿Qué pasó, Yolanda? Te busqué, Yolanda, y no estás, Yolanda. ¿Dónde estás, Yolanda? ¿Qué pasó, Yolanda? Te busqué, Yolanda, y no estás, Yolanda. Te vas. Gracias.
The version we just played is you, right? It's from one of your concerts.
Right. That's a live version, not the original recording.
The original version. Okay. Now, when you're on stage, Timothy, It seems like when you deliver this song, are you kind of mad at Yolanda? I mean, you kind of take a tone with her.
I'm a little put off by it, but, letting her know, I'm still looking for her. I don't know how the reunion is going to go, but I'm still here.
There you go. There you go. Pink Martini has been really a phenomenon around the world. It's been called a small orchestra, of course, many times. And I think looking back at your track record, you've played like every major venue there is on the planet, right?
Yeah, a lot of them. Yes, for sure. One of my favorites is the Royal Albert Hall in London. We just played at just a couple of weeks ago. And yeah, we've played, I would say, most of the iconic venues in the world.
Where do you still want to go? What's on the group's bucket list for a venue to play?
I can't really think of a venue that we haven't played at. I think it would be kind of cool to play, an arena if the band became so big that we could fill an arena. But we play the Hollywood Bowl
regularly, yes.
Regularly every other year, I think, or something. And that seats 18,000 people. And, we've done 3 shows in one series, like on a weekend. It's kind of like an arena.
Yeah, 18,000 times 3 is a lot of people.
And Hollywood Bowl is probably my favorite place to play in the whole world. I grew up in LA, and so I still have a lot of friends, and until recently had a lot of family. They all moved to Idaho, but I grew up seeing shows there, and I never imagined myself being on that stage, and I love it.
It is a pretty special place. I've attended several concerts there. This next song, if I'm pronouncing it right, it's Zundokobushi?
Zundokobushi.
Zundokobushi. What's the origin of this song?
Originally written in the 40s in Japan, and what I would say the vast majority of non-Japanese speakers don't realize is that it's actually kind of a sad song. It's about a gentleman going off to war, and his loved one, his lover, is saying goodbye to him at the train station. But as he's hugging her, he's eyeing another woman that's kind of in the shadows. So it's kind of a song of a love triangle and the sadness that goes along with, saying goodbye to the 2 women that he loves. He gets a letter from his loved one, and it has stains of her tears on the letter. And yet he wishes that he had gotten a letter from the other woman. And it's quite risque, I think, for the 40s, especially in Japan. But the song has been done by many different groups over the years, many Japanese groups. And Thomas discovered a version by a Japanese group called the Drifters, or Drifters. And they had a show, a live TV show in the 60s. And this song was their opening song, and they would all do this funny dance. And I think there were, 4, 5, 6 gentlemen. And I don't know if they always wore a black suit, but that's just in my head. That's what I remember. So Thomas discovered this song several years ago and just fell in love with it. And it's so completely different from anything else that we do. And I think that's what Thomas loves about it. I think sometimes people hear it for the first time at our show and they're just like, what is going on? And it's a wacky song. It reminded me of my Uncle Hito, my Japanese Uncle Hito. And we were in the recording studio, and I was in my own little booth to do the lead vocals on it. And when you're recording, when there's an instrumental part, you can kind of play around in your own booth because they're just going to cut my mic off during the instrumental part. But they didn't cut it off. And I was doing these funny noises because it reminded me of my Uncle Hito. And so when we were little kids, when we would open presents at Christmas and stuff, my Uncle Hito, he didn't speak English very well. And so he would say, whoa, bigla. He didn't know what else to say. And so we went back to listen to it after the first pass. And they said, what were you doing? What was that noise you're making in your booth? And I told them the story of my uncle, and they loved it. And so we just kept it. So in the recorded version, you'll hear that kind of funny noise. And anyway, that explains it.
All right.
So
here's Timothy. Timothy, I think you're right about this being kind of a 60s era song. I get kind of a Batman vibe a little bit in the beginning of it, right?
Yeah.
That Neil Hefti kind of bass line going on.
Yeah, and then the end. It's been a while since I've heard the recorded version, but kind of a surf band kind of feel to it.
Pink Martini's now, how old, 30 years?
Yeah. Well, Thomas started the band, I think it was in November of 1994. And so, yeah, in November, we'll be celebrating 30 years.
And you guys tour, what, like 100 nights a year?
It's closer to 170.
Wow.
I believe that starting 2025, we'll go down to closer to 125 days a year. So that's kind of the plan. We're in and out so much, and, we're not getting any younger. So yeah. I think some people in the band really want more of a break.
Now, is there a Pink Martini bus that you have, or how do you guys get around from place to place?
We don't have a bus. I wish we had a plane. But yeah.
That would be the coolest paint job if you had a Pink Martini plane. Oh my God.
Yeah. When we tour in the States, we're on 2 tour buses. And typically when we're in Europe and the UK, we're on 1 double-decker bus. Mm-hmm. So, that double-decker bus I think there are 20 bunks on the bus up top, and on the bottom there's, like a little kitchen and a lounge and big screen TV, and it's like a moving bar at night. If it's after a show, it's really, really fun.
That's great.
Yeah.
I got to find one of those buses. That would be a great thing for one of our events. Take people on a long trip. Timothy, this has been great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for supporting the band, and I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Palm Springs, Los Angeles, and Malibu. Okay, Tom, we are done.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 22,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by archivist Kelly Policelli. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and I'll be back soon with another beautifully landscaped, jazzy edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
What Adam 12, Rampart. We have a 4-alarm fire at Pullen Park. Please send in the 6-year-olds.